So yeah, as was mentioned, I specialize in real-time visualization. It's what I'm going to be talking to you about today, or as I like to call it, lifecycle visualization. I'll rush through the slides a little bit. I've got a bunch of slides to show you, but really I'm just talking about some of my philosophies and opinions, which you may or may not agree with. And then hopefully I'll show you some fairly exciting stuff. One particular case study, which a lot of you will have seen, but for the people that won't, hopefully it'll be pretty interesting. So our company often gets tagged as doing virtual reality. That's not how we like to view ourselves. How we like to view ourselves is we create 3D interfaces with a user-focused kind of philosophy. So it's all about the end user and how they interact with our 3D models. Something that I've heard a lot recently, actually I've been hearing it for about 10 or 15 years, is this whole concept of build twice. Build twice, once virtually, and that's really key, once virtually. What I've seen from a lot of projects is we do a heap of modeling duplication. So the architect will do some modeling just to win the job, then they'll win the job and do a bunch more modeling, restart from the scratch, maybe get in a visualizer to do some modeling. The various contractors are doing a bunch of modeling because they don't have the right models or the right kind of systems. So it's really ideally what we want to get to is modeling once. But of course, this is really hard because there is no one single application. We all use different applications and they have varying levels of compatibility with each other. So there is no one. And sorry, Autodesk, but you know, we still have competing applications. And that's a good thing because really, you know, we want competition as a consumer and an endpoint because it means that we don't get stuck into a particular process, that we don't follow a program's idea of how we're supposed to design and develop buildings. So something that kind of Adam Sheether talks a lot about, and I kind of completely agree with, is this idea that we're moving a lot of files around at the moment. And files are big. What we really want to be doing is moving the data within the files, especially the specific piece of data that makes sense to us. So it's not about moving files, because usually they're large in size, they're proprietary, so you might need a specific piece of software to open them. And we generally don't need the whole thing, just one or two little bits from within that file. So it's really about moving data around. And if you think about a BIM, it has heaps of stuff, and a federated model has lots of specialist people and contractors' IP in it. So the BIM is fundamentally about the interaction of geometry and the associated data. And we can disassociate those two things. And we can kind of think about the data as spreadsheets, and we can think about models in terms of how we're interacting with them. And we're getting really good at the data, I think, as we've seen from a lot of the presentations today. You know, moving the data, making sure that it's consistent, making sure that across the life cycle it's starting to make sense, and we're getting pretty good at that. But what we're not really good at yet is kind of the 3D modeling aspect. It leaves a lot to be desired, really. Especially when you think about end users that don't know how to use 3D models or aren't really experienced with them. So this is kind of the space that we're trying to fill. You could say that we're currently in the uncanny valley of 3D models. Does everyone know what the uncanny valley is? Anyone not know what the uncanny valley is? So the uncanny valley is a concept that was developed for robotics. And what it really says is that we as humans like things. So if we take a robot and make it into a cube, and it does something useful for us, we like it. And we're good with that until it reaches a point of realism. So where a robot becomes almost human, but not quite human. And then it becomes really horrible. And if you look at the graph of this thing, all of a sudden it drops off. And it's not till it actually becomes totally real that we like it. So I guess I'm postulating that we're kind of in the uncanny valley of facilities management at the moment, or 3D modeling, where our models to us look really good because we understand the idea, the use, and the data behind them. But to everyone else, they don't quite look like reality. So they know there's something quite wrong. You know, we've kind of modeled this whole column, but we don't have every bolt on it. So it doesn't quite fit with us. So that's kind of what I think where we are at the moment. The one place where that doesn't happen is in high-end visualization. So, you know, getting a company to do you a 3-minute video, which is photoreal. And that kind of gets back up that slope out of the uncanny valley. So it's kind of where we are, I think. And, you know, it's all about kind of making beautiful environments. And when they reach a level of realism we're happy with, then we engage with them again. But this doesn't really happen much. And the reason I think it is because making beautiful models is really expensive. And all you have to do is look at the computer game industry to understand how expensive. Does anyone play games? Call of Duty? No one? Okay. Well, one or two. So Call of Duty is a massive computer game, and just to give you a bit of a sense of the cost of developing one of these video games, I've kind of taken the 3 top ones. So Call of Duty cost $250 million to make. So $50 million in development and $200 million in marketing, which is massive amounts of money. And really, our industry doesn't have the budgets to support these types of modeling costs, which is why our 3D models don't get there, unfortunately, and really leave a lot to be desired, like I said. So we need to look for efficiencies. We need to find ways that we can make our models really beautiful across the entire life of the development and make them useful at every point and then reuse them. So rather than kind of duplicating modeling and getting the visualizer to do a bit, that when the architect makes something, they make it in such a way that it becomes a useful tool for the facilities manager. And this idea of the virtual asset kind of sits at the base of this, where since we're building a model virtually, ideally, that this becomes an asset and becomes an asset for the entire life of the building. I think that we're reaching a point where the virtual version of a thing is becoming as important, almost if not more important than the real thing. Maybe not more important because if the real thing didn't exist, we wouldn't bother with the virtual model. But in terms of how we interact with it, most people spend their life here and they never even look at the architecture. So we need to start kind of putting the information about the architecture in the building and the built environment around us into this virtual asset, which kind of makes them aware of the world that they're existing in, or at least the physical world that they're existing in. And interacting with virtual space is really all about interface. So one thing that I've kind of come to recently is this idea of interface. And I was kind of thinking about this for another presentation, and I kind of thought about what is an interface. And I thought a handle for a hammer is an interface. But really, interface is the only way that we deal with digital stuff. It's the way that we kind of interact with data on a screen. And we've been doing this ever since computers kind of came along. So I'm sure a few people recognize something like this, command line. I was really young when we did this, but kind of started me on this path of computer engagement, I guess. And then we kind of moved up to something like folders, which I think we're all really familiar with. And what it did, it took a physical concept like files and folders and turned it into a ubiquitous way for storing data on a computer. And I think we're all kind of making sense of that. What I think is really funny is that Windows 10, or kind of where we're heading now, is almost heading away from folders, where we don't have this physical link with things anymore. Things just happen. So things like web services, information, it kind of just appears as we need it, or that's the kind of the ideal. When I was lecturing at university, I started to discover this, where when I started, I was using Windows 98, and I knew where every file and everything was on my computer. But when I left lecturing, the students didn't know where their files were, which I found really bizarre. They'd kind of open their file, do some work, close it, and I'd say, open the file. And they'd go, how? And it's like, well, just go to the folder you put it in. And they didn't even remember where they put it, or didn't know where they put it, because they didn't understand that concept. I think it's really indicative of where we're going with computers and technology in general, where it's starting to disappear, where we don't really know how the back-end systems work, because all it's doing is working perfectly and giving us, helping us get the jobs done. Of course, that Windows 10 thing is moving more towards this iconography thing, where there's small icons, less text, kind of visual cues to how we do things. And that's kind of led into dashboards, and more dashboards, and more dashboards, and information overload. And it's kind of where we are at the moment. You know, I think a term that I really like is this idea of the data lake or the data ocean, where we're collecting so much data, like terabytes or picobytes of data every day these days, and just finding ways to store it. And big data has become a thing. Government loves big data. They want to grab as much data as possible and essentially shove it into a database somewhere just so they have it. But in reality, it's getting really hard to search all that data. You know, certain things we can do with it, but it just keeps growing. We're getting more data than we know what to do with on a daily basis. This image is actually the building management system or the control interface for a wind farm. It gives you a bit of a sense of where it is. And the project, which I'll show you in a second, Barangaroo, has a similar type of interface where I think it takes about 3 months just to learn the dashboards. There's that much information in there. Barangaroo, I think they're saying, will have about 2.5 million data points when it's all up and running. And so these dashboards aren't really adequate anymore to deal with it, not without a lot of training, and not when we want to kind of people, non-skilled users, to be able to interact with that data. So what does the future of interfaces look like? And I think we already know, at least partially. Looks something like that. This idea that we get to kind of control information around us. So Minority Report did it, Iron Man did it, and it's kind of all really cool. I can just go up, I can shift my building around, do stuff. I actually don't like gestures. I think it's over the top. I don't want to be swiping things away. I just want to be kind of clicking, which makes more sense to me. And the reality of this is it's actually going to look more like that. Some guy with a few screens, not kind of beautiful and wonderful like Iron Man, and trying to type on a virtual keyboard. So at some point we're going to move away from this keyboard and have different ways of kind of entering data within it. Of course, this is augmented reality, and I think we've seen a few examples of it today, and I think we're getting really close to good augmented reality. I personally think we're still a little bit away from it being kind of ubiquitous for us. And really where we are at the moment is virtual reality. So VR, I think, is solidly entrenched in everything we do these days. But again, this is what we want it to be. And a lot of the VR hype kind of shows this idea that I'm standing on top of the mountain and I get to turn around and feel the space. I'm never sold by it myself. I always feel like, where's the cold wind? Where's the kind of the sound of the eagle flying above me? I can still hear the toilet flushing behind me, and it kind of breaks that reality. So that's what we want. I think it's going to be a little while before we truly get there. And again, where we're at with virtual reality is something more like this. This was about a year and a half ago now, but it gives you a bit of a sense. So these are all people, all these people on this screen here, and they're looking at a virtual screen, other people playing a video game and viewing it in this space. So this is virtual environments, but we're not to the point yet where our computers or our phones or whatever can handle enough information to draw a fully animated character or a whole room full of fully animated characters. It's just too much computing power. So that's kind of where we're at. I find this kind of hilarious that even in a virtual world, we're still stuck to this idea of a screen, that we're sitting in a screen looking at a screen. Kind of self-referential and weird, but it's kind of where we're going. So at the core of this is this idea of virtual environments, and that kind of goes back to this virtual asset where we have a single thing which allows us to do a lot of stuff and contextualize all this data around us. And so the future of, I think, interfaces is more like this, where we have this basic virtual environment which can be output to a lot of different things. iPads, virtual reality, augmented reality, coming holographic displays, and we have to start thinking about that in terms of future-proofing our models. So how do we make sure that the models we create now, 5 or 10 years from now when we have new technology, are still useful? Because no one wants to go back and essentially spend budgets on making new models of existing buildings. So what we're trying to do, sorry about that, I'll have to reconnect to that in a second. We're essentially trying to link the value chain, where if we look at the various stages in development, this is a kind of a condensed version of it. There's budgets for each of these. The bid phase has a certain budget to win the project. Design development has a good chunk of money to essentially develop the architecture, the building, collaborate with contractors and so forth. Then the marketing phase. These guys have a lot of money. They're the ones that get a large chunk of money for one thing only, to sell the building, lease it, show it, whatever. Then commissioning, construction, handover, which we know are all pretty skint, and then operational. And operational, they have good operational budgets, which go on for 20 or 30 years, but they don't have capital budgets. So by the time we get to handover and operations people, they don't have the money to spend on making a fully interactive virtual model of their environment, which is part of the reason I think that we haven't really seen BIM for FM take off yet, because the capital cost of doing it well at the end of construction is still too much. So that's the problem we're trying to solve. And really it's about extending the value of the marketing activities to provide 3D interfaces for facilities managers. So, case studies. I'm going to show you virtual Barangaroo. bunch of you have seen this before, but I'm going to show about 5 or 6 different versions of this throughout the last 4 years. So we started this about 4 years ago, and we've done a lot of work on it since. We've done about 35 contracts on virtual Barangaroo, which really fits with our philosophy. This idea that bit by bit, you can build a virtual environment as the need and value arises. So rather than kind of saying it's going to cost you $1 million to make this virtual environment, 5,000 here for an image, 2,000 there for a video, maybe an induction video or a fire evacuation video, then using that virtual model to link to the building management system, which might be a little bit more, but again, you get value out of the existing work already done, and slowly kind of take this environment throughout the whole life of a building. It's a really different way of thinking about kind of virtual architecture. So, it's a lot of stuff in what I'm going to show you. So just to give you a bit of an idea, that's some of the file types which we used or kind of got given for this project. So heaps of different stuff, about I think 13 or 14 different file types, and gigabytes of information. So when it first came to us, and this was 5 years ago, so it was pretty early in doing these things, we just got a mess of information. And the environment, which I'll show you, runs really well on my laptop. So look, I'm going to just jump out and start showing you this stuff because it'll be a lot more relevant. Oop. So once it loads up, sorry, you weren't seeing anything I was just doing then. I didn't realize that. Cool, perfect. But now my computer's frozen. Good, there we go. So this was the first environment we did, and this was the proof of concept that helped us win the job. So Lendlease had decided for Barangaroo that they wanted a full integrated environment. They wanted to take all of the pieces of software, that'd be lighting controls, building controls, HVAC, electricity, concierge, room booking, a whole bunch of different things. I think they initially mentioned about 20 or 30 different pieces of software. They wanted to combine it all into a common environment. And that made a lot of sense about 7 years ago when they were kind of deciding this. But one of the things that they didn't even think about that back then was BIM. In fact, if you look at the original plan, BIM was never even mentioned. 3D was kind of mentioned, but it eventually kind of they did get a BIM execution plan, but it wasn't part of the integrated plan. So at some point they went, actually, let's make it BIM enabled as well. So they took this environment, and this is the proof of concept we did. In about 5 days, we took all of those various file types that they gave us, jammed them together, and integrated with the building management system in the back end just to show them that we could do it. And it was all about proving this information. So let's jump back in. And what we see here is kind of just a virtual version. So this was made in UDK, the previous version of the Unreal Engine. And we kind of did a few things like temperature sensors, kind of fans, and these fans were spinning at the actual speed. So in the demonstration we did, we had a fan on a table, we had a controller, we had the building management system, all on different computers, and we gave them a dial, and they let them actually turn the dial to kind of change the speed of the fan. And you saw it all lockstep happening. So as the real one was turning, this one was kind of speeding up in time along with it. So that kind of got us this job, but they wanted a lot more. So the concept was, how do we go further with this? And they wanted to do a whole bunch of things. So they wanted an alarm to happen. And you click that alarm and it takes you to the relevant point. You know, that there's a temperature sensor currently reading 28 degrees Celsius. We kind of look around and we see that all the other temperature sensors, 22, 22, 23. So in an open plan space, we could make a pretty quick assumption that that's probably a broken sensor. And they could then drill down to the building management system and decide some bunch of stuff. But what's that mean in operations? In operations, it means that maybe we don't want to fix it. We might want to 9 p.m. at night on a Wednesday night or something like that. We don't want to call someone out to fix the temperature sensor. It's going to cost a lot. So maybe we can think about the few people that are here. We kind of bring up the hot desking solution, see who's sitting on what table because they've RFID'd into the various tables, see that there's only 9 people or 10 people on this floor, and kind of step outside the building and see if we can possibly deal with the business processes. So here's 7 occupied. There's a bunch of desks free down here. So let's kind of confirm that, send them down, jump back into the building, see that it's closed, potentially access the cameras or the locations, wait till everyone's moved, shut down that floor, create a work order so we can fix that temperature sensor tomorrow when it'll be a lot cheaper. So that was the concept. And it was, cool concept, fairly nice, kind of won us the job. So that was fairly cool. And then that led on to a bunch of contracts. I'm going to show you a few things now, a couple of live environments and a couple of visual environments, which is really what our company is all about, kind of taking those 2 different approaches. So what you're viewing now is what we call virtual Barangaroo. And just so you know, none of this is videos, I'm just doing all of this live. So just kind of fly out. And what we have here is all of those various file types jammed into a single place. So originally, in Revit, each of these buildings was split into 3 sections, and then each of those sections had about 10 or 15 related files, whether it be mechanical, architecture, structure, et cetera. And so there's a lot of files, and they'd never actually seen the building in a full version because it was all split into pieces. So outside of a single really expensive video that they got a visualizer to do, they'd never actually seen the whole thing. So this was the first time they started to understand what their entire project would look like by the end. And you can see the level of detail it goes down to, essentially anything in the model. So this is one of the main reasons we use game engines, is they're really powerful. They're really good at doing stuff that we can't do in something like Revit. So let's kind of fly into the floor. And you can kind of see we've gone down to a pretty high level of detail in terms of how this all works. One thing that they discussed, but they never kind of enacted, was actually then displaying the screens on the screens in the virtual environment. So linking into the system so we could kind of go say who's working on what and where are they working. Proof of concept, we've done it, but not in the real environment. I think there are some privacy issues, which kind of fair enough, really. Yeah, exactly. But as you can see, like they took some, and this kind of speaks to our whole process. So about 7 years ago, they took some drone imagery from various heights to kind of see what the views would be outside the windows. They used it for one particular marketing purpose, but then had never used it again. So as opposed to a lot of people, we were just like, please, just give us more information. As much information as you have, let us take it, because we'll integrate whatever we can into this environment. So these are the real views that you get from the windows of level 48. And there's the virtual model. So kind of nice overall, but it's not just a pretty picture. Behind all of this, we've actually retained the data. So when we've kind of sucked in the various BIMs and any other file types, we've made sure to retain the information behind them so we can do stuff with it. So one of the things we did, first of all, with that was we linked it up to the program schedule. So I had P6 or Primavera, and we took an export from that and then linked it up with this. So the idea is that you can go to any point of time and see what it's like. Of course, there's probably cheaper ways to do this, and there are, like in something like Navisworks and so forth, but we saw this more as front-facing, where the quality of the visualization means that in terms of a high-end, like an executive or a presenter, allows you to understand it a bit more. And this was used less by the project managers and more by the bank, which was moving into, I think, 24 floors of this tower. So what they used it for was change management. They'd been given a bunch of documents, Gantt charts, and kind of schedules saying that this is when they could do certain things. But being finance people and bankers, they didn't understand it. So they looked at it and said, well, we don't get it. Can you give us a bit more information? So they used this to help phase their change management and kind of understand at what point they could move certain people into the building and make sure that there wasn't a kind of jackhammer 20 meters away from them. So that's kind of what this was used for. Like I said, we've done about 35 contracts, so there's been a lot of stuff in here, kind of public domain stuff, interaction stuff, put in the hoarding at one point. So when we first put in this hoarding, there was a line on the plan, and again, the Westpac executives didn't understand it and were concerned about the safety of their people. So we made a module, propagated across that line, and let them see, and a couple of design options in terms of what they could get. So this is like one of the first examples of that. When we did it originally, it was just grey. It was just kind of, grey hoarding or whatever. And then the marketers saw it and said, can we put the signage up? And so we did a signage exercise with them where we essentially added in all the signs and allowed them to walk around and interact with it. So I must say it was really fun when we first did this model and got the first Oculus Rift. I put it on and stepped off the edge of a building, which kind of gave me vertigo, and I kind of understood what it was like to die. It was kind of fun. So that was fun. And in this model, there's about 600 million polygons running pretty smoothly on my computer. So it's quite an intense model, and we've done a lot of little pieces. We've done a shooting game, a paintball game for one of the executives who won an innovation award for all of this, and allowed them to run through and essentially paintball the entire space. We did a balloon game in virtual reality for a bunch of kids. So there's been lots of little things that have, I guess, extended the value of this environment overall. So I'll show you a few more of them. One that we did was a basement signage exercise. So they'd gone through a process of getting a lot of signs made up, really beautiful, nice signage, stack of A3 papers about that thick. And going through it looked fine, but they really didn't understand how it was going to work. So this is one value point that we helped them with, because we essentially did the signage for them in the environment. And again, kind of being a little bit playful, we took the car that was one of the executives' cars and let him drive it around. So, which really just got engagement into the whole process. I'm not very good at this game, so. But yeah, and kind of what they found from this was that a lot of the signage wasn't appropriate. It was too small, and it was going to lead to a redoing or remanufacture of the signage. So they went through, and rather than install it, realize it was bad, uninstall it, remanufacture it, install it again, they tested it virtually. They got to walk through, and there's been another couple of versions of this since then, which go into a higher level of detail. But for a first stage, this kind of helps them. So quite a big exercise. Now, let me just connect quickly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to connect to the building management system. So, and these are using my own credentials, so they know I'm logging in at the moment. So if you're kind of worried about security, I don't have access to a lot of the subsystems. A lot of the really critical systems, they haven't actually integrated into this platform, but I can show some basic stuff. So let's bring up this one. And this one. So while they're loading, because this one does take a little bit of time to load, and what I'm about to show you is two different iterations of the operational model. So that massive environment we just showed you is essentially the core model that we use to do a whole bunch of different things. So I think the file itself I just showed you is about 35 gigabytes. And then the one that we have back in the office, well, not one, it's more like a programming environment, but we have hundreds of gigabytes of versions of this thing which have been produced at various points. So I'm just going to leave that and log into this. And while that's loading, I'll show you the type of qualities which we're now reaching. So the quality I've been showing you really is the quality from 4 years ago. So we got to a point with this where we were pretty happy with it, but we've come a long way in terms of quality. And so the kind of current level of quality that we're doing has finally, really in the last year, reached marketing levels where we're now doing traditional visualization jobs because the quality that we can now pull out of a real-time environment has essentially ticked over into that kind of useful point for them. So, and you can kind of see the level of detail and quality that this is. So we're pretty proud of this stuff. So, a lot of work to get here, but it's kind of been a fun little engagement throughout the process. And you can walk around, interact with things. This one was made as a virtual reality experience to sell the apartments. So it's in a display suite, which allows them to walk through, interact with things, and rather than buy by plan, buy by virtual reality, which is kind of fun. And then instead of kind of doing a rendering, which they want lots of, you just go in and press your camera button, kind of set all your various fields of view, all the rest of it, and take a picture. So that's what a render should be. A render shouldn't be 3, 5, 10 days to get a pack of images. It should be click a button and pull out a really nice image for your client, whatever they want to look at. So almost there. So what this one's doing is essentially loading a bunch of BIM objects into cache. So what we've seen from a lot of the facilities management BIM for FM stuff out there is that they're pretty slow. That when you click an asset in the BIM model and you want to get the data, it can be 5, 10, 15, even seconds or even longer to essentially bring it up. So we've kind of combated that by saying, let's preload everything or kind of like load it in using game concepts on the fly, which means that we can access data much quicker. It's actually been one of the big challenges throughout it. This was an early iteration of this, and it was really proof of concept. Unfortunately, this one didn't go forward because there was a lack of information in the BIM, which I'll kind of get to in a second. So what you're seeing now is live data coming through to this building. What I'm going to do is make it transparent and go in and see. So go to this light. That light currently on level 15 is on, and we could probably verify that if we had a camera in the space. That temperature sensor on level 15 is 22.38 degrees Celsius, and there's the BIM data behind it. So this is all the BIM information, which is really about exposing it to people that don't really understand what BIM is. That's the live data point. So this is any point that we're pulling through for that particular device. And each one of them represents one of the 2.5 million data points, which will be operational in BIM eventually. And then a link back to the building management system itself, so you can log in and kind of do all your BMS stuff. So, and that could be anyone. It could be any lighting service provider. It could be Siemens. It could be anyone which has some type of data feeding through to this information. So it's kind of fun. What I really like is just kind of showing this. For me, I've been modeling for 15 or 20 years now, and the joy of being able to fly around a complex model at kind of 40 to 50 frames per second actually gives me a real thrill. So what I've just done is I've linked into anything that we're pulling some type of live data to from this model. And so, let's kind of turn that off quickly. Adaptive view distance, and bring that up. And yeah, this is anything that we have some type of live data stream to at the moment. Of course, all the values are 0 because this one's largely been decommissioned except for a few particular devices. The reason for that is that they didn't, in their original BIM execution plan, they didn't define what had to be done. So we had various levels of quality of BIM come through from all the different contractors. Some of it was 2D plans imported into the levels and done in BIM file format. It's like, wow, that's not a BIM, and it's very far from it. It's not even 3D modeling. It was just imported plans. So it meant that there was a large data mismatch between devices and assets. And so we kind of offered a few ways to fix it, and this is what we've kind of come down to. So this is now currently being used in the operational control center at Barangaroo to run the buildings. More to enhance how they run the building. So what you're looking at is essentially the alarms which are currently coming through from a various set of systems throughout it. So if you zoom in, you can kind of see how many alarms for each floor. Red is obviously critical. Something critical happened. Green, kind of don't even bother about looking at it. And you kind of get down and see the level of detail. So we didn't get all of the assets across all the floors, but what was done well was the plant rooms. So we could kind of represent them pretty well in here. And let's kind of bring up the alarms list. And we've got, you can see a bunch of things in here. And what we can do is, let's go to one, which is interesting. And we can essentially see where these objects are in this space. So turn this off and bring up that one. And we can kind of see log into the OBSI data again, or we can interact with the actual asset information. So the relevant BIM information behind it, the live data coming through, that value probably means on or off. A new alarm just came through, and that's for some doors. So it allows them to visually understand where the information is happening or what's happening in their building at a glance. That's the basic idea of it. So pretty cool stuff. And it's fun looking at the basement and just seeing the level of complexity in here. So we can go to a particular asset like this one and understand what's happening. So this input is closed, that's the BIM data, and we can kind of make selection sets which allows them to monitor particular items or objects within the building. Still a long way from completion because we don't have 20 systems. We've got about 2 or 3 systems currently in here. But we're still working with them on it. So 4 years in and still developing this virtual asset for them. So let's jump out of that one. So I should probably finish. They're probably, sorry. A couple more things and then I'll just finish off quickly. So lonely screen. Okay. So what I'll do now is just show you some of the mobile versions that we've done for this. So it should be my phone. Good. And bring up mobile virtual Barangaroo. So at one point, they stopped being interested in the kind of PC version, and what they wanted was the mobile version. So we essentially took that same model, spun it out, and then made kind of this leasing application. So they used this to help lease certain floors of Barangaroo, and they did it so rather than doing a physical fit out, a test fit out and showing what it looked like, they could jump in here and have a bunch of big blue spots on the floor with a plinth with an iPad on it, and any potential tenants could come up, pick it up, and then kind of look around and kind of see what the space looked like. So, and kind of walk through it. And again, it's really all based on kind of speed and how well these environments work. So it's a pleasure to use, really. And you can kind of get a sense of what your office should look like before you get there. And just kind of tap around the space and go, yeah, we'll rent it. Thanks. So that was one of the things. The other little thing that we did was a bunch of VR kind of video fly-throughs. So this is now a 360 video. And is everyone a Google Cardboard? Yeah. So this is my favorite Google Cardboard. This one is really cool. So it fits in my pocket. $10. And you can kind of just give this to a client. So quite simply, chuck that in and then look around the environment. So just another output, but again, type of thing that if you tried to do this for the entire Barangaroo just for this one particular purpose, would have been really outside their budget. Because we had the whole environment, it was really quick and easy for us to essentially just do a 360 video. I think that cost about $1,000 or something like that for a 3-minute 360 video. So you start getting the value from these virtual assets over time in terms of, I think we've done about 45 minutes of video footage, hundreds, if not thousands of images, so just renders, that kind of got to the point where in terms of interior fit-outs, we were using renders to essentially just show what the space looked like. So, and I'll finish up really soon. I'll just show 1 or 2 more things, and then I'll be done. So we also did the office fit-out, which I'll just give you a really quick look at. Has anyone been to the Lend-Lease offices at Barangaroo? A few people. When we did it, it was pretty funny. We spent 6 months kind of working with them on this virtual model beforehand, and the designers used it for design kind of development. And I got deja vu when I walked in here. It was bizarre because it wasn't deja vu, it was actually memory. I knew exactly where everything was going to be because we'd represented it in this real model, which was kind of fun. So, and you can kind of walk around. I knew when I was walking around a corner that there was going to be a chair sitting there, and there was. It kind of blew me away. It was quite a fun experience. This one had a few different things in it. Again, views from kind of 3D, which they largely used to, for a kind of design by committee type thing with 10 or 15 people in the room, and got sign-offs on things like the length, the width of these little slats, which allowed you to get a peek in at what was happening in the rooms, what furniture they're going to use, what flowers they're going to use. They ended up not using these flowers because they hated, one of the executives hated them, but kind of gave a bit of a sense. And then multiple floors and different design options. So, and look, I can show you more of that, but I'll jump out and show this the last one. So this is one which was kind of developed a bit of fun. This was done with a client in Malaysia, and it was really just to show their house. They wanted to see what it looked like, but we kind of took it a step further and showed, it's done a while back, but I think a few concepts in here are still really fun. And I imagine this if you're doing a large set of housing developments or a bunch of kind of apartments and a thing. So rather than buy by plan, you walk in, you get your people, and you go, yep, bring up the various material options. So go through, define what materials you want in your building. that links back to, say, a quantities schedule. And so before you even kind of begin construction of the building, you can know exactly which materials go where, what the quantities are, order large amounts, and make a lot of things. In the long run, I think that would then be something you get as a tenant. So when I buy my apartment and I move in, I get a link on my iPhone, I download it, and it becomes the control interface to all of my objects. So smart buildings, I don't want lots of apps. I want a single 3D environment which allows me to interact with all the data around me. So if I left the fan on, did I leave the oven on? You can go in and check and kind of, turn it on or off just by clicking it. What are my kids doing? Are they watching TV at the moment? And so this is now streaming YouTube onto the TV. So if you had a smart TV, you could link in the live image and show it. And so I think this is how the future of interaction is going to happen. I think it makes a lot more sense, and it really brings it down to the lowest common denominator. So people are scared of iPhones and data, but what they're not scared of is the 3D environment. They already get it. So they can be not stupid anymore, and they can look and say, that light there, turn it off, done. And I think that's kind of how we're going to be interacting with objects in the future. So on that note, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy my presentation.